Baghdad, 786. The Tigris River cuts through 750 feet of city that will become the wealthiest on earth. Harun al-Rashid, 20 years old, tall, olive-skinned, takes power on September 14th. His brother died mysteriously. His mother, Al-Khayzuran, a former Yemeni slave, orchestrated it all. Within hours, 5,000 armed men drag the rival heir from his bed, force him to renounce at sword point. The ring passes. The Abbasid Caliphate, stretching from Spain to India, now answers to a man whose childhood tutor was Yahya the Barmakid, a Persian whose family once guarded a Buddhist monastery in Balkh. Harun's treasury holds 900 million dirhams, his palace, an institution, inside its walls, a world most will never see. Hundreds of enslaved women. Thousands of eunuchs, a system that will define Islamic courts for 5 centuries. What actually happens behind those curtains? How does a slave become property? Where do the eunuchs come from? And what does the procedure cost them? The receipts exist. The chroniclers documented everything. This is what life looked like when Baghdad ruled the world. If you value documented Islamic history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Also, this script is researched and factual. Using sources from Al-Tabari's History of Prophets and Kings, completed circa 915 Dar, the multi-volume chronicle that remains our most detailed primary source for Abbasid court life, cross-referenced with al-Mas'udi's Meadows of Gold from circa 943, which provides economic data and cultural details that Al-Tabari omits, plus Nabiyya Abbott's Two Queens of Baghdad, published 1946 by University of Chicago Press, the foundational academic work on Al-Khayzuran and Zubaydah that uses Persian and Arabic manuscripts unavailable in earlier scholarship, and the recent Cambridge World History of Sexualities, published 2021 with its chapter on 9th and 10th century Baghdad sexuality that synthesizes decades of archaeological and textual evidence. Now back to the information. Harun's mother set the template. Al-Khayzuran came from Yemen as a slave, sold in Mecca, bought by Caliph al-Mahdi, freed, married, bore 2 sons who both became caliphs. When al-Mahdi died in 785, her eldest son al-Hadi took power and tried to shut her down. She kept receiving male officials. She kept giving audiences. She kept running policy. He assembled his generals, asked them, "Who's better, you or me? Obviously you, commander of the faithful. And whose mother is better, mine or yours?" They knew the trap. He wanted her in seclusion. She refused. He died mysteriously in September 786. 1 year later, Harun became caliph. Al-Khayzuran ruled through him until she died in 789. 3 years. She'd gone from enslaved property to the most powerful woman in the world's richest empire. The harem system made that possible. Even as it imprisoned everyone else, Baghdad's harem wasn't just the caliphs. Every wealthy household had one. Women stayed out of sight. The term harem doesn't appear in the Quran, but commentators found verses about modesty and seclusion, built religious rationale around them, used the hijab verse to justify separation. Under the Abbasids, this became law in practice, if not in text. By 800, prosperous women remained hidden. The caliph's mother sat at the top of his household hierarchy, not his wives. Islamic law let him have multiple wives, had to treat them equally, couldn't elevate one above another. No queen consort. His mother filled that void. After her came his legal wives, his slave concubines, his female relatives, his slave servants, then the eunuchs. Everyone enslaved except the family. The numbers scale up. Under Caliph al-Muqtadir, who ruled 908 to 932, the harem contained 4,000 enslaved women and 11,000 enslaved servants. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in 1258, they inventoried the last caliph's possessions: 700 women and concubines, 1,000 eunuchs. The caliph begged, "Let me keep the women, upon whom neither sun nor moon has ever shone." They let him select 100. Then they killed him. His household was slaughtered or enslaved again. Historian Wasaf wrote, "They swept through like hungry falcons attacking doves, like wolves attacking sheep, with loose reins and shameless faces." The system that had stood 5 centuries collapsed in days. But in Harun's time, in 786, the structure was new, still building. The slaves came from everywhere. Islamic law said you can't enslave Muslims, so traders ranged across 3 continents: Europe, Africa, Asia. The main routes: north through Persia from the Volga trade route, where Vikings sold Christian and pagan captives, mostly Slavic, Finnic, Baltic people, plus some Western Europeans. These were the Sakaliba, the luxury goods. East through Central Asia from the Samanid Empire, mostly Turks. Geographer al-Maqdisi, writing circa 985, noted that the annual tribute to Baghdad included 1,020 slaves. south through the Red Sea from East Africa to Jeddah and Mecca, then by caravan across desert to Baghdad's slave markets. Also south through the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf, landing at Basra, Ras Al Khaimah, Dubai, then upriver. India supplied slaves too, conquered territories, tax levies. Contemporary writers estimated 300,000 slaves lived in Iraq by the late 9th century. Around 15,000 worked the marshlands around Basra at any given time, 1/4 of the region's labor force. They died so fast from malaria that traders had to constantly replenish them. Slaves weren't allowed to marry or have children in these work camps. The conditions triggered the Zanj Rebellion in 869. It lasted 14 years, came within 50 miles of Baghdad, killed tens of thousands. One of the most brutal uprisings in Islamic history. That's what happens when you work people to death in salt marshes. The slave trade divided people into categories: male, female, eunuch, also by skin color, also by origin. European slaves served elite households. African slaves worked fields and marshes. Turkish slaves became soldiers. Persian slaves filled administrative posts. Indian slaves did various labor. The chronicler Jabir ibn Hayyan wrote that the best female slaves were those born in Mecca regardless of parents' ethnicity, raised speaking Arabic, trained from childhood in customs and service. Children of two slaves were born slaves unless the father claimed them. Since people believed different races had different abilities, slave breeding was common. In Kufa, they crossed men from Khorasan with women from India to produce offspring with delicate brown complexion and beautiful stature. This went on so long that Kufan slaves became more valued than Basran slaves, though Basra still produced the most expensive concubines. Female slaves fell into subcategories. Jawari were entertainers, Kiyan were singers, Maziyat were concubines, Kahramanat were stewardesses. The Kahramana ran the harem, acted as governess, functioned as intermediary between sequestered women and the outside world. Only women allowed to leave and enter freely. They shopped, managed merchants, handled affairs. The Jawari entertained but weren't automatically concubines. They could transition if the Caliph selected them for sex, but they occupied separate categories. During Al-Amin's reign from 809 to 813, there emerged a special class called Hulamiyat, slave girls dressed as boys, trained to sing and perform at drinking parties for the Caliph and his male guests. European slaves were particularly prized for harems. Traders sought them young, before accents formed. Parents would sell or give away daughters they couldn't afford. For the girls chosen for looks and intelligence came intensive training lasting years, languages, music, poetry, dance, sexual arts. They learned to move through a world where men owned everything they interacted with. The 10th century Kitab al-Aghani, the Book of Songs by Abu al-Faraj al-Isfahani, preserves accounts. Some passages voice complaints that women were wrongly enslaved, suggesting freeborn girls sometimes got caught in the system. The boundaries between slave and free blurred more than law admitted. In Harun's own household, the concubines had names and stories when chroniclers bothered to record them. Helana had been property of Yahya, the Barmakid. She begged Harun when he was still a prince to take her from the elderly Yahya. Harun approached Yahya, who gifted him the girl. She died 3 years later, 789 or 790. Harun mourned deeply. Dananir was another Barmakid slave, educated in Medina, studied instrumental and vocal music. Marjil came from distant Badghis in Persia, one of 10 maids presented to Harun. She gave birth to Abdullah, future Caliph al-Ma'mun, on the night of Harun's accession, September 7th, 86. She died in childbirth. Zubaydah, Harun's wife and cousin, adopted the boy. Qabiha, mother of al-Mu'taz, Mukarik, mother of al-Musta'in. Both were European Saqaliba. 2 of 12 caliphs, mothers whose nationalities are known, came from European slave stock. The genetic mixing was so complete that by Harun's time, the Abbasid bloodline included Persian, African, European, Arab, Central Asian ancestry through generations of slave concubinage. Royal legitimacy flowed through enslaved wombs. The scale of procurement was industrial. The 4 main methods: kidnapping, slave raids, piracy, buying children from poor parents. Vikings played a crucial role in the European supply. A 10th century biography of St. Naian records 200 churchmen captured by Vikings, taken to slave markets in Venice. Historian Mary Volante argues Vikings raided monasteries specifically to capture literate young males who could be castrated and sold east. The raids began barely a generation after the Abbasid dynasty seized the caliphate. Baghdad's new harem system created massive demand for trustworthy guards. Eunuchs filled that need. Young educated men from monasteries were perfect raw material. Venice served as processing center. Castration happened there, then shipment eastward. The business model worked for centuries. The castration itself. Islamic law prohibited castrating Muslims. so eunuchs were always foreign non-Muslims. The procedure had variations. Kasi meant removal of testicles. Atlas meant complete removal, everything cut clean. Medical texts describe both. Paul of Aegina, Byzantine physician who died circa 640, wrote that increasing employment of eunuchs by his time had resulted in mounting pressure on physicians to perform castrations, thus violating the fundamental medical principle of restoring nature to proper function. Persian author Abu Zayn Kahal presented a treatise to Timurid ruler Shahrukh between 1405 and 1447, 24 chapters on surgery. Castration was the third chapter, preceded only by introduction and circumcision. The importance was obvious. He states that persons are made eunuchs for the purpose of privation. He describes Kasai and Atlas, excision of testicles versus clean removal of all external genitalia. The formulations are imprecise enough that Kasi might simply describe complete removal done step by step instead of one sweep. Al-Jahiz, the 3rd and 9th century prose writer, claimed every castration in the world originated in Byzantium. The Rum, together with the Sakaliba, are the only nations to practice castration, a most odious crime and a sign of their pitiless natures and corrupt hearts. But Islamic society needed eunuchs, and acceptance of possessing them eventually overrode the social and legal barriers. The procedure was brutal. The story of Bakit in the 1001 Nights anthology describes a young slave brought from his native country at 5, castrated after puberty following an illicit affair with his owner's daughter. During my unconsciousness, a barber was sent for, who castrated me completely and cauterized the wound with red-hot irons. Many didn't survive the operation. Many more died during transport. Mortality rates were staggering. Those who lived faced permanent physiological changes, hormonal imbalance, underdeveloped secondary sexual characteristics, sometimes higher-pitched voices. They entered a distinct social category, neither male nor female in the system's eyes, yet they gained power. Eunuchs served the Caliph's harem, but also rose in administration beyond it. The Abbasid period made them permanent fixtures. Under al-Muqtadir, 1,000 eunuchs served. 3 achieved high rank. Mu'nis al-Muzaffar, who died 933 or 934, served as commander-in-chief of Abbasid armies from 908 until death. A eunuch leading the military. The chief harem eunuch controlled the imperial pious foundations for Mecca and Medina, which supplied grain and services to the poor and to pilgrims, contributing to the Caliph's status as custodian of the 2 holy cities. Power and emasculation intertwined. The logic was cold. Eunuchs couldn't sire children, posed no threat to royal lineage, had no family to split their loyalty, perfect servants for positions requiring trust and discretion. The harem women lived in layers of restriction. Nabaya Abbott, preeminent historian of elite Abbasid women, described it: the choicest women were imprisoned behind heavy curtains and locked doors, the strings and keys entrusted into the hands of that pitiable creature, the eunuch. As the harem grew, men indulged to satiety. Satiety within the individual harem meant boredom for the one man and neglect for the many women. Under these conditions, satisfaction by perverse and unnatural means crept into society, particularly in its upper classes. The marketing of human beings, particularly women, as objects for sexual use meant that elite men owned the vast majority of women they interacted with, and related to them as masters to slaves. Yet some women wielded influence. Zubaydah, Harun's wife, member of the Abbasid family herself, would have at her table only vessels of gold and silver studded with gems. She built infrastructure, funded the famous pilgrim road to Mecca with wells and way stations. She competed in conspicuous consumption with her husband's concubines. The fabulous descriptions in the 1001 Nights are idealized, but had basis, in fact. Untold wealth had flowed into Baghdad since its founding in 762. Leading men and their wives competed in displays. In Harun's reign, this reached levels unknown before. The brilliant culture had limits. Apart from philology, intellectual disciplines were in infancy in the Arabic world. But the luxury was real. Harun's court was enormous. Numerous eunuchs, concubines, singing girls, male and female servants. He was connoisseur of music and poetry. Gave lavish gifts to outstanding musicians and poets. Abu Nuwas, the poet whose verses extol good living and carousing, often bawdy, was said to be Harun's drinking companion. Ibrahim al-Mawsili brought Islamic music to new heights during this reign. The first paper mill opened in Baghdad. Technology acquired from Chinese prisoners after the Battle of Talas in 751. Jafar, the Barmakid, persuaded Harun to establish it. This revolutionized knowledge dissemination. The House of Wisdom, Beit al-Hikmah, began to take shape, though it wasn't fully established until circa 820 under al-Mamun. But the foundation was Harun's. Baghdad flourished as world center of knowledge, culture, trade, all of it built on slave labor and imperial extraction. The Barmakids managed everything. Yahya the Barmakid was vizier. His sons Al-Fadl and Jafar held high offices. For 17 years, they controlled the empire's administration. They provided money for court luxury and extravagance. They were extraordinarily competent. Yahya showed great wisdom in selecting and training subordinates. They patronized sciences, helped propagate Iranian scholarship into Islamic Baghdad. They established the first paper mill. They became fabulously wealthy. Yahya had gold tiles on his mansion walls. Jafar's mansion cost 20 million dirhams. Whenever Harun toured Baghdad and saw an impressive house, he was told it belonged to the Barmakids. They commanded an army of 50,000 men, technically under the Caliph, but controlled by Al-Fadl. During the last days of their power, Al-Fadl brought 20,000 men to Baghdad as the Karnabiya Legion. Harun grew wary. The end came January 28th to 29th, 803. Jafar was executed suddenly. Yahya and Al-Fadl were arrested, properties confiscated. The decision shocked everyone. Gossip claimed Harun had arranged that Jafar secretly marry his sister Abbasah on condition they never consummate it, that they could spend time together without breaching restrictions on women. The story goes that Jafar and Abbasah fell in love. She bore a child. Harun learned and executed Jafar in rage. Modern historians, including Al-Tabari and Ibn Khaldun, reject this as unconvincing legend with no basis. The real reasons were political. The Barmakids had become too powerful, overshadowed Harun himself, made decisions without consulting him, entered his presence without permission. They favored Persian and Eastern provincial interests, the secretaries and civil servants. Harun's new vizier, Al-Fadl ibn al-Rabi, favored the religious scholars, many Arabs, many from Western provinces. This political cleavage ran deep. It would continue half a century. Jafar also released an imprisoned Alid rebel without Harun's approval. Alids were descendants of Ali, alternative power center, constant threat. Harun may have feared the Barmakids could use their wealth and Persian connections to install an Alid in place of Abbasids. The family was destroyed overnight. Jafar's body was displayed. The dynasty Harun's mother helped build now faced its greatest internal crisis. Harun tried to prevent future power struggles by dividing authority between his two eldest sons. Al-Amin, born shortly after Harun took power, son of Zubaydah, full Abbasid blood. Al-Mamun, born the same night Harun became Caliph, September 7th, 86. Son of the Persian slave Marajil who died giving birth. Al-Amin would get Iraq and western provinces. Al-Mamun would get eastern provinces. Both signed documents in Mecca during pilgrimage in 802, promising to support each other's rights. The documents were placed in the Kaaba's inner sanctum as sacred oath. Al-Amin had Arab tutors, favored religious scholars after 803. Al-Mamun had Barmakid protege Al-Fadl ibn Sahl as tutor, favored Eastern interests. Harun made the cleavage manifest. This wasn't incompetence. This was recognition of political reality, attempt at controlled resolution. It failed. Harun never saw the failure. He was leading an expedition to suppress rebellion in Transoxiana when he fell ill at Tus in eastern Persia, March 24th, 809, probably a stroke. He died shortly after. His treasury still held 900 million dirhams. His empire stretched from North Africa to India, but the cracks were showing. Tunisia was semi-independent under the Aghlabid dynasty since 800. Morocco was independent under Idrisides since 789. Egypt had revolted twice against financial oppression and misgovernment. Syrian tribes resented losing dominance. Provincial autonomy stirred everywhere. The War of the Two Brothers erupted immediately. Al-Amin became caliph, but Al-Mamun, based in Khorasan, refused to submit. Civil war. Lasted 4 years. Baghdad suffered. Al-Amin's regular troops were well-off property owners, demoralized when bombardment devastated neighborhoods. The urban proletariat stepped up. Street vendors. Naked ones, people from prisons, riffraff, rabble, cut purses, people from the market. These irregular troops, many of African origin, became known as the Naked Army because they fought without armor or body protection. They improvised helmets from plaited palm leaves, made shields and reed mats covered with tar and stuffed with sand and gravel. They became the backbone of defense. Al-Mamun won anyway. Al-Amin was killed in 813. Al-Mamun ruled until 833. Attractive figure, diligent, humane, intellectually curious, great sponsor of learning. But the war fatally weakened the military class that supported the dynasty. Neither Al-Mamun nor his successors created satisfactory substitute. By mid-9th century, Sizis, caliphs found themselves at mercy of expensive Turkish slave soldier Praetorian Guard who made and murdered caliphs as impulse dictated. The caliphate began to fragment. Warlords and provincial leaders paid little heed to the caliph's wishes. By century's end, The empire Harun bequeathed was fading memory, but the harem system survived. It outlasted the Abbasid dynasty itself. When the Fatimids rose in North Africa, they copied it. When the Ottomans built their empire, they expanded it. The chief harem eunuch of Ottoman Empire in the 18th century was enslaved in Ethiopia, transported to Egypt for castration, sold in Cairo's slave market, presented to imperial palace, worked his way up over decades. The use of East African eunuchs became standard. Availability was key factor. Egypt tapped slave caravan routes through Sudan. Muslim kingdoms along Red Sea coast raided Ethiopia, transshipped slaves to Arabian Peninsula. Ottomans in late 16th century conquered chunks of Horn of Africa and Sudan, gaining direct control over routes. Cultural and linguistic differences between African eunuchs and Balkan or Caucasian harem residents prevented meaningful contact, romantic or political. That was the point. In later life, harem women, especially the Sultan's mother, forged influential political partnerships with senior eunuchs. The system persisted until the 20th century. Slavery was formally abolished in Iraq in 1924, first Gulf state to ban it. Saudi Arabia didn't abolish slavery until 1962. Yemen and Oman followed by 1970. The Afro-Iraqi minority today descends from these slaves. The slave trade to Baghdad followed clear patterns. From the north came the Volga route. Vikings took captives in Ireland, England, France. Some went to Dublin slave market. Some to Hedeby in Denmark. Some to Brno in Sweden. Then via Volga to Russia. Slaves and furs sold for Arab silver dirhams and silk, found in Burqa, Wallen, Dublin, initially through Khazar Khaganate, then from early 10th century through Volga, Bulgaria, then by caravan to Khwarezm, to Samanid slave market in Central Asia, finally through Iran to Baghdad. From the west came the Red Sea route, East African slaves transported to Jeddah, Mecca, Medina, then by caravan across desert. From the south and east came the Indian Ocean route. Dhows carried slaves from East Africa across to Persian Gulf ports, landing at Basra primarily. In 1847, British consulate in Baghdad reported, the average import of slaves into Basora is 2,000 head, in some years 3,000. But for year 1836, no more than 1,000. Of slaves imported, one half usually sent to Muntafiq town on Euphrates named Sukkis Shuk, spread all over southern Mesopotamia and eastern Syria. One quarter exported directly to Baghdad. Remainder disposed of in Basora market. The trade was systematic, organized, lucrative. Prices varied by origin, age, skill, appearance. The best Kian, the elite singing slave women, trained for years, could command enormous sums. They performed publicly, even though privately owned. This public exposure gave them power, fame, notoriety. They were described as carnal and domineering in love. Most in demand were European sakaliba. Slave traders sought them very young, so they'd speak Arabic without foreign accent. Their families would sell them or give them away out of poverty. For the few chosen for looks and intelligence came intensive education extending several years, fitting them for high society in Baghdad and other Abbasid cities. From adolescence, they learned singing, lute playing, composition, poetry, calligraphy, the arts of conversation and flirtation, how to navigate elite male competition. The most successful became celebrities. Stories of Utbah and Inan, preserved in multiple sources, show educated slave women participating in gift exchange, negotiating their evolving status, speaking out against mistreatment. The line between slave and slaver was continually challenged to the extent that a slave kaina could gain advantage over her patron. Some even protested they'd been wrongly enslaved, that they were freeborn. Whether these claims succeeded isn't recorded, but that they were voiced at all indicates the system's complexities. In the Caliphal harem, concubinage eventually replaced marriage as dominant institution. But in elite and common urban households, marriage appears to have remained dominant. The dividing line between marriage with free woman and concubinage was thin. Marriage was seen as form of ownership of woman by man, same pattern as ownership of slave by master. Free women experienced what scholars call quasi-slavery. The society was hierarchical. Men stood over women regardless of status. The rise of concubinage in early Abbasid era impacted free women who'd previously enjoyed form of political independence. The gradual preference for concubines altered their position significantly. The boundary between hara, free woman, and jariya, slave, blurred. Enslaved women could rise to positions of influence as mothers of caliphs. Free women found themselves subject to increasingly strict seclusion. Both groups were controlled. Sexual access to slave concubines was made legal through specific regulations. Theoretically free of moral inhibition, free men could engage in legal sexual relations with slave women outside bonds of classical marriage. This wasn't hidden or shameful within the system. It was explicit policy. Female slaves were primarily used as domestic servants or concubines. Male slaves were used in labor, administration, military. The gender ratio of slave trade was roughly 2 females to every male. This wasn't accident. Demand for women drove the market. Women for domestic service, women for sexual slavery, women as status symbols. Outside explicit sexual slavery, most female slaves had domestic occupations, which often included sexual relations with masters. This was lawful motive for purchase, and most common one. Children born to slave concubines could be claimed by father and become free, but only if father chose. Otherwise, they remained enslaved property. The economic impact was massive. Baghdad became the world's wealthiest city. Trade flourished, industry developed, textiles, metal goods, paper, ceramics. Tigris was 750 feet wide at Baghdad. Docks and wharves held hundreds of ships. Warships, trading vessels, including Chinese junks, pleasure boats, caravans connected Aden, Syria, Egypt. They connected Baghdad to India and China. Muslim ships dominated southern Mediterranean, extended across Arabian Sea and Indian Ocean to Far East. Indian Ocean became great trade route. Arab merchants were a familiar sight in India. Muslim traders spreading language and religion to Southeast Asia. By the 800s, over 100,000 Arabs and Persians. Jews resided in Guangzhou, China, having voyaged across Indian Ocean. Muslim merchants reached as far as Korea. Baghdad's location was genius, access to both Tigris and Euphrates systems, close to main route through Zagros Mountains to Iranian Plateau, wheat and barley from Al Jazeera, dates and rice from Basra transported by water. The city Al-Mansur founded in 762 had grown beyond all expectations. The round city with 4 gates, palace and mosque in center, was government quarter. Markets banished to Kark suburb to south. Other suburbs grew. Harbiya to northeast, where Khorasani soldiers settled. Across Tigris on east bank, palace quarter for the air, all of it expanding, thriving, consuming, and all of it dependent on systems of control. The harem kept women invisible. Slavery provided labor and luxury. Eunuchs maintained boundaries. Wealth extracted from provinces flowed to the center. When the system worked, it produced splendor unmatched. When it broke, it shattered completely. The question isn't whether the Abbasids were unusually cruel. Slavery existed across all contemporary civilizations. Byzantine Empire, Chinese dynasties, European kingdoms, all used enslaved labor and practiced gender segregation in various forms. The question is what the specific Abbasid system looked like in practice, how it functioned, what it cost the people inside it. The chroniclers gave us the numbers and names. Al-Tabari documented court proceedings. Al-Masudi recorded economic arrangements. Abbott synthesized palace archives. We have purchase records from slave markets. We have medical texts describing castration procedures. We have architectural remains showing harem layouts. We have grave goods indicating status levels. We have legal documents defining rights and restrictions. What emerges is a picture of Baghdad in 786 to 809 as a place where extraordinary intellectual and cultural achievements happened alongside and often because of systematic human exploitation. The paper mill that revolutionized knowledge preservation was built with slave labor and administered by men who kept hundreds of women in sexual servitude. The poetry and music that defined the era was often performed by enslaved women trained from childhood for elite male pleasure. The administrative efficiency that managed an empire stretching 3,000 miles relied on eunuchs who'd been mutilated as boys, and Turkish slave soldiers recruited from Central Asia. The mother of Caliph al-Ma'mun, who would patron the House of Wisdom and push scientific advancement, died in childbirth as enslaved property and was her son raised by her owner's wife. The wealthiest city in the world in 800 was built on the backs of 300,000 enslaved people in Iraq alone, tens of thousands dying annually in Basra's marshlands, replaced by constant supply from 3 continents. This isn't moralization. This is documentation. The system had internal contradictions. Slave women like Al-Khayzuran could become the most powerful woman in the empire. Eunuchs like Munis al-Muzaffar could command armies. Educated slave women could speak out against mistreatment and sometimes be heard. The boundaries weren't absolute. Social mobility existed within the system for the exceptional few, but mobility within oppression is still oppression. A slave woman who becomes queen mother is still someone who was bought and sold. A eunuch who becomes commander still had his genitals cut off as a boy. The singing slave who gains fame still can't leave. The system's flexibility made it more sustainable, not less brutal. It incorporated resistance, absorbed protest, granted just enough possibility to prevent total revolt, until the Zanj rebellion proved it couldn't absorb everything. 15,000 slaves in Basra work camps, dying of malaria, forbidden to marry or have children, worked until replacement was necessary. 869 they rose up, built their own stronghold, held territory, fought for 14 years, came within 50 miles of Baghdad, killed tens of thousands on both sides. Al-Tabari and al-Mas'udi called it one of the most vicious and brutal uprisings of all disturbances that plagued the Abbasid government. It failed, it was crushed, but it happened. The fall of the Barmakids on January 29th, 803 marked the beginning of the end. Jafar's execution was so sudden that stories sprang up immediately. The forbidden romance with Abbasa, the jealous Caliph, the violated oath. But Al-Tabari and Ibn Khaldun, writing with access to better sources, pointed to the obvious. Yahya entered the Caliph's presence without permission. The Barmakids made policy decisions without consultation. They commanded 50,000 troops. They owned the most impressive houses in Baghdad. They had accumulated such wealth and influence that they left too little scope for the Caliph. When Harun moved against them, it was political calculation, not romantic rage. He imprisoned the family, but in confiscated properties, displayed Jafar's body as warning. He replaced them with al-Fadl ibn al-Rabi, who lacked their efficiency but favored different constituency. The empire immediately became less stable. Revolts increased. Provincial autonomy accelerated. By the time Harun died at Tus in 809 Ars, the unity his reign supposedly represented was already fragmenting. His sons tore it apart. The War of the Two Brothers from 809 to 813 devastated Baghdad. The naked army of urban poor defending against al-Mamun's eastern forces showed class divisions clearly. When al-Mamun won and ruled until 833, he couldn't rebuild what war destroyed. The Turkish slave soldiers he and his successors increasingly relied on became kingmakers. By mid-9th century, the Caliph's authority was nominal. Provincial dynasties ruled independently. The Zanj rebellion in 869 to 883 showed that even enslaved people could threaten the system when conditions became unbearable. The caliphate limped along until 1258 when Mongols finished it. 700 women and 1,000 eunuchs inventoried like furniture. The last caliph begged for his concubines. They killed him anyway. The legacy isn't in the empire's territorial extent or military victories. Those were temporary. The legacy is in the institutions that outlasted the dynasty. The harem system established under the Abbasids became template for Islamic courts for 5 centuries. The Fatimids copied it. The Safavids expanded it. The Ottomans perfected it. The use of eunuchs as guards and administrators spread throughout Islamic world and lasted until 20th century abolition. The preference for slave concubines over legal wives in elite households persisted. The architectural separation of women's quarters became standard. The slave trade routes established in the 8th and 9th centuries continued operating for over 1,000 years. When British consulate in Baghdad reported on slave imports in 1847, they were documenting a trade established under Harun al-Rashid. When British forces liberated 80 enslaved Armenian girls from Muslim households in Baghdad in 1917 during World War I, they were breaking chains forged in the Abbasid era. The excavation at Samarra, the palace city al-Mutawakkil, built in 836, where the court moved after Baghdad, shows harem architecture clearly. Vast women's quarters separated from public areas by multiple walls and corridors, guard posts at every transition, servant passages allowing movement without visibility. The aerial photographs reveal the entire plan. The city was abandoned when caliphs returned to Baghdad in 892, which is why remains survive intact. This is what the system looked like physically. Miles of walls to keep women invisible. The prosperity of Harun's reign made this level of construction possible. The 900 million dirhams in his treasury paid for palaces that required armies of slaves to maintain. 20 years, 786 to 809. Harun's reign bridged the peak and the decline. When he took power at 20, Baghdad was rising. When he died at 42 or 45 at Tus, the empire was fracturing. In between was wealth beyond measure, cultural flowering, scientific advancement, architectural splendor, and systematic brutalization of hundreds of thousands of people. The 1001 Nights romanticized it. The Arabian Nights entertainment made Harun a legendary figure. Charlemagne exchanged embassies and gifts with him, recognized him as power, on par with the European emperor. Historians writing centuries later called it the Golden Age, the honeymoon of Islam. They weren't wrong about achievement, but achievement and oppression aren't opposites. They were intertwined. The paper that preserved knowledge was made by enslaved workers. The palace that housed intellectuals was guarded by castrated men and filled with enslaved women. The caliph, who patronized poets and scientists, began his reign when his mother, a former slave, orchestrated his brother's mysterious death. The vizier who administered the empire efficiently and built the first paper mill was executed without trial and his family destroyed overnight. The woman who gave birth to the future caliph, who would establish the House of Wisdom, died as property during childbirth, never free. The numbers don't lie. 700 women, 1,000 eunuchs, 4,000 enslaved women under al-Muqtadir, 11,000 enslaved servants, 300,000 slaves in Iraq by late 9th century, 15,000 in Basra marshlands, 2,000 imported annually to Basra in 19th century, 1,020 slaves as annual tribute from Samanids, Jafar's mansion costing 20 million dirhams, 900 million dirhams in the treasury. These aren't estimates. These are documented figures from chroniclers. Administrators, geographers who recorded what they saw. Al-Tabari completed his history circa 915. Al-Maqdisi wrote his geography circa 985. Al-Mas'udi finished his Meadows of Gold circa 943. Abbott published Two Queens of Baghdad in 1946, using manuscripts these medieval sources couldn't access. The Cambridge World History of Sexualities synthesized this evidence in 2021 with archaeological data. The sourcing is solid, the documentation is extensive. What we're left with is a portrait of the fifth Abbasid Caliph, ruling at the zenith of empire's power, remembered as patron of knowledge and culture, whose reign was built on foundation of human commodification so systematic it established patterns lasting a millennium. When you hear about the Islamic Golden Age, this is part of what made it possible. When you see references to Baghdad's splendor, this is how that splendor was maintained. The intellectual achievements were real. The scientific advancements were genuine. The cultural flowering was extraordinary. And all of it happened in a city where hundreds of thousands of people were property, where women were kept hidden, where boys were castrated and men were worked to death, where revolt was crushed and dissenters were executed and power was maintained through violence and control. Both things are true. Both things matter. The legacy is complicated. The documentation is clear. Baghdad in year 800 was the wealthiest city on earth. It was also the center of a slave empire that extracted humans from 3 continents, processed them through trade routes spanning thousands of miles, and turned them into servants, soldiers, concubines, and eunuchs. Harun al-Rashid presided over this system at its height. He didn't invent it. His predecessors established it. He didn't perfect it. His successors expanded it. But his reign, from September 14th, 786 to March 24th, 809, represents the moment when everything that would define Abbasid court culture for the next 450 years locked into place. The harem system, the eunuch corps, the slave soldier army, the concubine preference, the architectural seclusion, the brutal economics, the cultural achievement built on human cost, all of it documented, all of it real. This was life in Harun al-Rashid's Baghdad.